Data Storytellers, special episode today on the Data Storytellers podcast. You might notice that I say this often, but they are growing increasingly special because we have another exclusive club of people who've been on the podcast for more than once. And Kate is definitely someone who, if you've been following the podcast, that we had a fascinating conversation with. A bunch of you gave excellent feedback. Kate and I also met in Austin on our annual face-to-face, and she had a beautiful story around her journey of how to implement an experimentation focused culture based on her experiences at Expedia. And then when we recorded the previous podcast, she was working for an exciting company called Miro. A lot of you already use Miro. We even used Miro, I think, in Austin to help
We
the
did,
the
yeah.
learning experience. So yeah, we definitely made creative use of your association, but you just made a career move. So first of all, Kate, welcome back on the show.
Thanks so much.
And would you mind giving us an update of what's been happening in your career? You're with a new organization, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I've just moved to a new role. I'm working for a company called Shutterstock. So Shutterstock has been building out one of the strongest image content and now uh, 3D and video marketplaces, kind of an early internet company that has evolved along with the internet and now is doing really exciting things on both sides of their marketplace when it comes to generative AI. So not only do they have amazing tools that are really easy to be able to do some of the image creation that you've seen, but as a data person, it's really exciting what we're doing on the supply side to really take all of our valuable metadata, use that and partner with almost all of the big Gen AI models out there to help them better train their models and really kind of see how our curated and high quality content can be used. So it's really exciting stuff. And my role is as a senior director of marketing and product analytics. I'm really excited to work with their great team of both marketing analysts and product analysts.
So I remember when we did the first podcast and I asked you about Miro. Even then, I was like, wow, this is actually a really cool product. And then we ended up talking quite a bit about the product as well. I did not prepare for this in the before the conversation, but now that you mention it, when I think about Shutterstock, you have stock photos in your mind, and the advent of Gen AI now with Midjourney and all the other image generators. Wow, what are they going to do? And I'm sensing that Shutterstock, instead of trying to get entrenched in whatever they've been doing traditionally, they are taking advantage of
Absolutely.
these developments. So that's really cool. I never actually thought about like Shutterstock as a company, which would be a brilliant example of how these companies, which are new companies because they're internet companies, but we've been in this era for a while now. So there are old internet companies and newer internet companies as well. So Shutterstock, it seems like they're doing a great job of adapting to the new stuff.
Absolutely. And it's just an exciting time to be in this data space to really kind of test what is some of the data that we're going to use, better understand, and kind of build out models. And so we just signed a interesting agreement with Databricks. And so it's fun to
Mm.
be working on a product analytics, but with some of these vendors you've been using for a while. So we're going to see how all of it converges.
Okay, that's really cool. And then your role specifically now, so is it because I know that back at Expedia you were in data enablement, and then at Miro Marketing Analytics, and was definitely a thread there about experimentation. This was one of the things that were revealed to you that, wait a second, like what we've done at Expedia, people benefit from it a lot, and it was a very, very successful case study. And now your role, so if you compare it to your role over at Expedia and at Miro, how is it different? How is your career evolving?
Absolutely. I mean, really, this is a role to help me kind of put together a lot of pieces that I've been building up and kind of put together a lot of building blocks in one place. So I'm really excited about that part. I think at Expedia, I learned a lot about this dynamic of a two-sided marketplace and building out growth loops. And from an analytics perspective, the importance of really sound unit economics that allows that marketplace to thrive. we were working on vacation rentals. I was surprised in my first week at Shutterstock, the lingo, the acronyms are the same. Instead of the details of a vacation rental, it's the details of a photo, but they use
Mm.
basically all the same descriptions. So from there, you go on to get to see a company like Miro, which was really going through an insane period of hypergrowth where that lined up with COVID as companies had to send workers to work remotely. Enterprises would reach out to Miro to help build out that collaboration from a brand new remote workforce. And what we found at Miro was they had great foundations on their product led growth loops and their ability to kind of build out virality. People love the product. But then they had this new business of just these large enterprises who just called up and said, we need a contract. Tying those together, the small businesses, the one-off contracts, the kind of self-serve e-commerce business with these really large enterprise deals can be complicated from
Mm.
any sort of business and commercial analytics problem, right? How do we tie this together and give a holistic view of a customer? What is a customer? Is it a company? Is it a person? Is it, an interaction on the site? And so a lot of that has been relevant as Shutterstock is also thinking through who are their customers in this new generative AI world? Are they some of the biggest companies in the world, or are they still, somebody who is building a newsletter and just needs an image? And then I think the other piece that definitely ties together a bunch is this experimentation. It was really funny when I joined at Shutterstock. They said, "Oh, had you you worked in online travel? Have you previously worked with our head of product, senior product managers?" And unfortunately, they were at the competitor. So they were a lot of online travel folks who were at Booking and Priceline, and so they were willing to take a chance on me, even though I had kind of grown up with one of their competitors, and I really appreciate it. But they had all of this kind of love of experimentation, and so that piece, I'm not trying to sell. I'm really trying to really kind of help them kind of build and actualize it because I think we're all.
Facilitate. Yeah,
Yep.
no, that's awesome. So that's an interesting conversation when you're actually joining a company where there are already seeds of openness and foundations laid out. And it's a great example of how over your career you kind of earned that spot of now you can just work on something that's bigger and better than what you've done before.
Yep.
And it's interesting that you mentioned also how at Miro this hypergrowth ended up being almost like an identity crisis even for the company. Ooh, what are we doing? Who are we doing it for? How are we doing it? And then a lot of companies are going through that right now. So even those old companies that we work with, like Caterpillar, they are the construction equipment. It's a 100-year-old company, or even more. If Kyle from Caterpillar is listening, who's another
He's
alumni
getting
of
so
ours,
mad at
he
me
might be
about
like, Les, you must know we've been talking like 20 times. So anyways, that magnitude. And now they are also thinking about, okay, in this new age, we are solidifying that, but also now how we're going to do that is enriched with all kinds of digital product implementations and leveraging data analytics and IoT and all that. So that's really cool. Maybe let's talk about, because today the conversation ultimately was going to be about kind of looking at how you navigated your career to earn this where you are now, where you can leverage all these experiences that you're passionate about, that you love doing, and you can join an organization and just really give it a shot. And it's super exciting time now. Everything is changing. So what have you seen? And we can start exploring that. So what have you seen as the key pillars for your career success? So if you had to give advice to someone who's trying to achieve something similar, where would you advise them to start?
For me, I think the farther I get in my career, the more I appreciate starting with a really deep technical foundation and putting the time in to really embrace some parts of complexity in a way that I think can be challenging to do in depth later on in your career. A lot of folks will give you kind of some of these charts to look at about ways that you can go deep early in your career. And as you go through, you're only going to have, moments where maybe during a code review, maybe during a high stakes presentation, you'll get down into that deep complexity. but it's really building out those foundations, not necessarily even of what you're working on, but how you work. Are you able to spend, hours and hours really digging into understanding exactly where your data is coming from, exactly what it means, putting deep context that maybe requires you to talk to lots of people who have jobs that you don't think have anything to do with data, but like really embracing some of that complexity to build out not only your skills, but I think business understanding. And so starting with that really deep technical foundation has been something that I appreciate now, because I can almost go back to, it's been funny, even in the first couple of weeks of a new job, I go, oh, this looks so similar to a thing that happened 7 years ago that we spent 3 months on. And we ended up with one slide at the end, but it was an insanely complex analysis that gets so much faster the farther you get through your career. And so putting in the time early, I'd say the other reason to go really deep technically in your career, the earlier the better. Not everybody's career is going to turn out this way, but sometimes you just have a lot more time and
Hmm.
mental bandwidth. So if you're like me, where you started in a career before maybe having kids and a family, you might find that you can stay at the office until midnight a
Hmm.
few nights and really kind of encompass a whole really complex problem. Those moments are harder and harder to get to as your career and life kind of progresses.
Hmm. Absolutely. I do remember there's this, this might sound random, but I will connect it. There's that movie called Prestige with Hugh Jackman and Christian Bale about the competing magicians. And there's a scene there from Michael Caine where he tells Hugh Jackman that obsession is a young man's game. Right. And it's so true. Even just for me now that I have like a 10-month-old at home, well, okay, so what you can do earlier in your career is different, and actually growing is a wonderful thing in it. So it's almost like, okay, those things are sometimes taken away from you, but only so that you make space for those things that you need to prioritize if you're an aspiring leader. But technical foundation is super important. Do you have maybe a concrete example from the past where you really had this, you pulled it off, you did build good technical foundations that then actually paid dividends for you later on?
Yeah, I think one of them that I've been thinking about over the last couple of weeks was a time where I was working for a fintech startup, and it was kind of an early tech job. I'd come out of years in graduate school, and this startup was like mini startups, super chaotic. They had a bunch of different ideas. One of them might end up working, and one of them ended up being an early competitor to Stripe, where they had that first time you could accept credit cards with your phone. And, I mean, before that, people won't believe this, but it was really hard. You still accepted cash. And so we had a tool, we had the whole hardware piece of it. And my job went in the world of, I was doing business intelligence in financial operations. And I was really curious. I was just like, how on earth are we going to be able to compete with Stripe, who seemed like one of these huge venture backed entities? They were laser focused. And even in those days, we knew they were going to be somebody pretty
Hmm.
impressive. And it turns out we had made a bunch of business assumptions about the business model and the revenue model that was going to drive this acceptance. And yet, no one had actually been able to pull out some of this really old fashioned data that comes from credit card processors. Some of it looks like 1970s mainframe code. The reports they send you is called interchange reports. And so you have this like old low tech stuff that powers all of these kind of fancy startups like Stripe. So I ended up going around the office kind of late at night and asking a bunch of people to help me make these test transactions on this thing. And then I would follow the data all the way through. We'd actually, buy fake things, spend real money, and then we'd get it back from the bank, and I could figure out exactly how much Visa and MasterCard were going to charge us. And as soon as I had about 25 transactions, it starts to become increasingly clear to me that there is no way we're ever going to be able to compete with Stripe, because each one of these transactions is going to be like $2 plus, you know, a couple of basis points percentage. We knew exactly what the basis points percentage was going to be, but nobody had factored in that every swipe, Visa or MasterCard, also
Mm.
adds in $1 or two on each transaction. And it just never was going to work. And so I started to take all of this data, and I had to really both make it into a compelling summary, but keep all of the complexity, because this was not a story anybody wanted to hear, right? So I had to, show my receipts, like the kids say, but it was literally receipts, and really show that when we scaled out the unit economics of this business, it was going to be really hard for us to compete, and we would either need huge piles of venture funding or it wasn't going to work. And so, like, that was just a place where, like, putting the hours in, being curious. I mean, like, the technical analytics of it, I think I did it all in Excel. Like, it wasn't anything that I needed a bunch of Python for. But, just and then being able to kind of have some humility in telling the story. This was not a story anybody was going to want to hear, to say, like, hey, I think this is what I'm seeing. Can I show it to you? Can I get some feedback from you? Not I've figured out the big answer, especially as you're starting through that career. But it was one of those balances of just like, I think I've got all of this detail in the foundations. I'm going to go out and tell the story. And as I've gone through my career, I often come back to that example of, like, do I really understand how this business is going to make money? It's one of those things where you started a company, you think, well, surely somebody's looked at this before, right? Surely somebody knows how this company is gonna make money. But in analytics, and especially these types of commercial analytics roles, you can always find, a slice of the business where maybe there's more to learn.
This is fascinating for me for multiple reasons. One is that for some reason I've been following this whole payment processor thing from multiple angles. One of our other alumni is the VP of Data Science at MasterCard,
Yeah.
Dan Wald. Shout out to Dan, great guy. And so I kind of saw how things work over at MasterCard when it comes to the data analytics transformation. Obviously, again, old company, so lots of complexity. Lots of transactions, national, global, and all that. And then also because, I mean, I can say that we are a Stripe customer. That's how we process our, and there are a lot of great things about it because everyone knows Stripe. So there's immediately that kind of trust established. Everyone who sees Stripe, okay, I'm good. We're gonna be dealing with money. So they're almost like a classic bank where hey, we have the institution, we have the security, we have the processes, we have the trust. So you can give us your money, we can handle it. And we kind of give the guarantees. And at the same time, the fees are a pain point. So every small business owner, when you're generating revenue and you're pushing your profit margins, aggressive growth, and everything, then it hurts that it costs 3% or 2.97. So there are a lot of voices out there, out in the startup world, educated voices who say that, oh, you see, this is a typical example of how Stripe is a monolith that's established, but a young, fresh startup could just take over by being leaner and faster and all that. But you're telling me, you see that when you actually follow the data, when you, when they kind of do these medical tests, when they send down either like a probe or they color your blood with fluorescent, whatever, and they just follow. That's what you did, right?
Yeah, the forensics was fun. I mean, I've always loved, like a forensic investigation, and that part is fun, but it's so true. And it also really gets you to see for two-sided marketplaces or for large network effect companies, just the scope of how challenging it was to really build that trust, build that brand, and then be able to build the infrastructure, because Stripe was revolutionary compared to Visa and MasterCard and some of the old payment processors. But then you think about how was that facilitated? That was absolutely facilitated in a zero interest rate environment, right? Like, how are we going to be able to struggle, in the next round without possibly having those huge levels of investment to go through to basically get to that tipping point of having a huge network. And that's where I think you go back to these analytics basics and you go back to the technical foundation, because in some ways it becomes more fun when you don't have piles of cash to burn. You have to be even better. You have to be even more precise in your unit economics and your sources of leverage to be able to build, another game changer of a company. So I think it's challenging in some ways, but if you're in your career and working in a startup right now, and maybe it's a more exciting place, especially to be in analytics.
And so true that Stripe was at the right place at the right time with the right people. And by the way, they did an amazing job of taking advantage of that opportunity when that opened up. And I know because I follow a chap called Matt Lerner, who used to be the head of marketing over at PayPal. Just during that time, and PayPal was actually already a very strong established brand, but mainly consumer. And then they were just bleeding their B2B accounts to Stripe, and they tried to figure out how to stop that. So it's a cool story from all kinds of different angles. So that was great. I did not expect that story. How did that go, by the way, when you presented that data?
Yeah.
And you mustered up all the humility that you have. You cut down on all the complexity, so that, because look, you are against an audience where the hopes and the dreams and the desires and the incentives are all like against you, stacked against the other stacked against you. How did you handle that?
I think this is where it's also important to do some of the stuff earlier in your career, because I didn't really get it at the time. And so, yeah, no, I went to my boss and had the conversation, went through the data, and I think, learned a lot of good lessons about get in there as early as possible. Don't sit on those sorts of things, especially don't sit on bad news. And then, like in any company, let's learn from this and move
Mm-hmm.
on to what's next. And there were bigger and better opportunities that were a better fit for this company and for all companies. And so I think that's where you get into, okay, how can we learn from this? How do we make sure we don't have this situation again? In many ways, it got some of our back burner analytics projects that we've been talking about for a while accelerated, where we
Mm-hmm.
said, hey, we just really feel like we need to be taking some of these arcane reports from Visa and MasterCard and really parsing through them and making sure we can follow every cent. That had been something that everybody agreed maybe we should do. This kind of got some of those analytics projects off the back burner, and we invested in. So, I think that if you're in the right culture where people can listen to you and you can learn from it, hopefully it'll turn out okay.
No, that's so funny also because with startups, and I know from experience, especially small startups, they're more like projects, and projects change and evolve, right? It's not an entrenched organization. Once there's already like a deeply acquired identity, and you have that critical mass of the business when it took a life on its own, it has its own culture, then maybe it's harder to pivot. But you
Absolutely.
getting in there early was super beneficial for everyone involved, even though it was the more difficult thing to do. With it
Yeah.
was the morally compelled
It
choice
was
that you
always
had
a
to make.
side project. I don't even know if the founders even remember that we even tried this. Like
Okay, there you go.
this was not the key to their business, but it was a fun side project, and I got some good lessons out of it.
That's awesome. And then, uh, what other factors? So we are focusing on three main things, obviously, with the playbook. So from the technical foundations, what would be the second main factor?
Yeah, I mean, I think once you've got that technical detail, it is really important to figure out how do you get some of your uh, ability to do the storytelling and kind of build out this elusive executive presence we hear about. And so I think for me, a lot of what that looked like was, how can you thrive in these cultures where companies are growing, learning, and really respecting that? As well as, how can you tell stories around data and analytics at a much simpler level while still having that technical foundation beneath you? And so for me, like the second pillar for me has been, really understanding this idea of a growth mindset has been just a huge unlock for me because, I spent years in graduate school never fitting in, never really hitting my stride at all, where it always felt like there were smart kids and there were less than smart kids. And for the first time in my life, I was not one of the smart kids. And as much as you could study and study, if you didn't have some of that genius,
Hmm.
it was going to be really challenging for you to ever kind of gain respect. And yet, when I started to work in tech, learning from some really interesting leaders who had read some of this research about a growth mindset, they really started to kind of tell this story about how consistently learning and consistently looking at both our successes and our failures and really figuring out not necessarily, did we win or lose, but how are we going to get better tomorrow, was just such a kind of pivotal key for me. And so, when you're doing that from an analytics lens, I think a lot of times that can look like there are these really complex technical projects, but are you able to try something out, try something that has business impact, tell a simple story to an executive to say like, hey, we've done all of this work. Now we want to go try something out for the business. And instead of saying, I'm the genius, I'm the one who has it all figured out, so you better just trust me, how can we as analytics leaders say, maybe it will work, maybe it won't, but this is the risk, this is the possible reward, and either way, we're paying to really learn something that we think can help us grow as a business. And so, like, for me, that idea of just, whether it's something as cut and dried as A/B testing, on an online e-commerce website, or it's something as tricky as like, we're going to change our pricing model and we're going to think about like, how do we crack the difference between large enterprises and one-off self-serve users and kind of build some sort of mid-tier project. Those are all really hard, high-risk projects, where instead of saying, is there one person out there, one consultant, one expert who knows exactly what the answer is, can we end up going faster and learning more by just saying, let's try something, let's see what we can learn, and then we're going to try again and again.
I follow basketball here and there. I mean, since Kobe retired, less so. But I noticed that the new winner of the championship is the Boston Celtics, and they have a head coach who's only 35 years old, Joe Mazzulla. And I just watched the post-game interview where, above all, they are asking him about, look, you are the analytics guy. You're famous for being the analytics guy.
He's fascinating.
Yeah. You've been following him too?
Yeah.
Okay, there you go. I know, I love the guy. It's a very interesting character, and brilliant too. And in a way where he said that, okay, it wasn't only about the analytics, but getting the organizational to buy into that. That we're going to approach this problem. We are an old organization. I mean, it's one of the biggest. I mean, the Lakers and the Celtics. And they have a past. They have an incredible story. But now the game is new. The game is changing. Now there's analytics. How are we going to pivot and take advantage of that? And he talks about how to gain the trust of management, of the players. He's only 35 years old, right? And his approach was also always underpinned by that humility of being factual, but at the same time not coming with some fake adrenaline, not trying to overpower people with where he's strong. Let's say if he knows more about analytics, or no, everyone needs to be on board. And he always said that he's more like a facilitator. So he does gain the buy-in from the business, and then he just kind of works on making sure that they can take advantage of that opportunity. It's funny. Have you been following Joe Mazzulla?
Yeah, I have. And this idea of like, what can we learn from sports? And I mean, global sports, not just American sports, from, as we're thinking about being, impactful business leaders, but also, this specific slice of analytics is really fun to me, because I think there's a ton where, in analytics, we are still not an old discipline. We're still kind of growing and trying to figure out where we're at. And there are going to be successes and failures in all of this work that we do. And my other we didn't talk about this beforehand, but my big basketball anecdote is like, the other guy I really love watching is, I'm not going to try his last name, but Giannis.
Oh yeah, Giannis, yeah, the Greek, yeah,
who is our kind of global superstar.
Mm-hmm.
And he gave an amazing postseason interview a year ago after kind of a crushing defeat, where he said, like, look, if you don't win, if you don't, immediately get promoted in your job, is that a loss? Is it a loss that is the whole season a waste? Of course not. We learned, we got better. And that really is all this growth mindset is just like, I mean, I made my kids watch it. I thought it was so inspiring.
I actually remember that interview.
Yeah, it kind of went viral. But I mean, like, when you think about this idea of like analytics, we are so it's so easy to be like, I'm just going to hire this one person who has all the answers, who's this one kind of genius person who figured out exactly what, problem to solve, how to put the puzzle pieces together at their last company. They'll be able to
Hmm.
do it at ours. And yet, these amazing sports teams, and I think even these amazing companies are really showing that you have to have these cultures of allowing for failure, allowing for learning, allowing for experimentation, because otherwise just a couple of geniuses aren't going to get us there. And there's a new book out about all of this, that really references Microsoft and kind
Hmm.
of says, like, you can look at some of these sports stars, and there are easy anecdotes to understand, but really some of the Nadella, Microsoft story is really one. And like, we're going to keep learning, and we're not going to just promote some of these geniuses. And I think the other piece for me is like, as an analytics leader, how do we also think about, building out some career paths for people where you're not just recognizing and rewarding some of these geniuses who work kind of independently, but how do we build out sustainable career paths for all the people who don't want to be in people management, but
Hmm.
actually make everybody around them better? Like, I think we need a lot better words for the people who make everyone faster, the
Hmm.
people who enable these, experiments and kind of bring a lot of new ideas to the table. We need to reward, a lot of these traits that you see in software is around an architect, right? Someone who brings a
Hmm.
ton of expertise, but also doesn't intimidate everybody at the table.
Hmm.
And that's one that I think, where I've seen all of those pieces work in a culture. It takes a lot of work from the top down. It takes a lot of education to kind of get everybody to buy in. That's where I've been able to see, especially I think at some years there at Expedia, where we really started to just experiment really quickly and see the growth follow.
Hmm. And did you have also with what you mentioned about gaining that executive presence and then learning those lessons? Did you have a mentor at any point who kind of opened your eyes to these things, or were these realizations that you had to just learn on your own, or
Oh
somewhere in
no,
between?
absolutely. I mean, I have been so lucky I mean, really, that's kind of one of the most fun things I think about one of these tech careers is you just get to sit in some of these rooms, especially in analytics, right? You bring something to the table nobody has. You've got some data that not everybody can see, and so you get to sit in some really interesting conversations. So for me, one of them was definitely working with a former CFO who had been kind of seconded over to work with analytics for a while, especially during COVID, who really gave me a lot of confidence around this idea of, we know you have the technical sophistication. Stop worrying about whether you're technical enough. You're way more technical than anybody else at this table. You're the only one who has this slice of data. Now you need to really focus on telling the story, being compelling, and get everybody else on this idea and vision. And so that just having someone give you that confidence to not be so technical can really be a catalyst in an analytics career, to say, like, leave that behind, put it in the appendix if you must, but really, you've got that strength. So a lot of times when I think about some of the conversations she and I had, it goes back to like, when do you listen to that idea of imposter syndrome, and when do
Hmm.
you just say, like, ignore it? And so she would often be like, look, you've earned the seat at the table. You guys have the data. Go in and present your ideas.
Hmm. Just having that confidence is absolutely huge. And it's fascinating to me because on one side of the coin, you need to develop those technical foundations, but then don't obsess over them. Almost like you can hide it, you can just use it as a source of confidence. You know that, but when it comes to the business interactions, that's a whole different game. So maybe we can spend a little bit of time on that. Maybe that's the third factor that we talked about, right? The business savvy. So there's a lot of mystique around that, how to acquire that business acumen. What is your approach to it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I had a different career path. So I always had a conflicted relationship with this idea of business education. In undergrad, I would literally sneak over to the business school and take like business classes at night while I was in economics, which was a pure arts and science, liberal arts. In grad school, the same thing. I wanted to learn R, and only the marketing department would teach it. So I would like
Mm.
go on a weekend course to learn R from a marketing professor. So I never had this MBA. And when I went into start working, especially in tech, I thought it put me in a huge disadvantage. And I thought there is this like secret world that these ex management consultants, these ex investment bankers have, and I don't have it. I'm never going to be able to figure this out. But because I was on the analytics team and I got a seat at some of these interesting conversations, I got to start watching these COOs, these CFOs, and how they would run meetings, and really, especially, how they would ask really savvy questions to be able to understand their own business's leverage as well as other companies' leverage. And that's that idea of what is your source of leverage? What is the thing that you have that you're going to be able to exploit? Whether and especially how sound are your unit economics, back to this idea of this kind of payment processing example.
Hmm.
At a small scale, does your marketplace, does your loop, does, even your supply chain work well enough that you're then going to be able to scale and find some more leverage? So, I really got to watch an inspiring leader at Verbo, who was just one of the, I mean, he had the Stanford MBA, he had all the credentials. And I often would like come home and I'd think like, well, I got paid for getting a free MBA today and I didn't have to go to business school because I just got to see it. um, that was so fun. And it also kind of gave me some confidence that like by being curious, by watching how people work, by really seeing what, tools and approaches and questions and frameworks that they use, you can kind of reverse engineer some of this.
Hmm. And when you were painting that picture, so the movie come to mind called Margin Call, which actually Dave recommended to me. Dave Coughlin. We're just releasing our 15 episode Advanced Business Communication and Storytelling for data professional series, and obviously we talked a lot about everything. But they were probably sometimes 2-3 hour episodes each, and Margin Call came up because it's iconic. Do you know which scene? And yeah, Jeremy Irons.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So that kind of executive presence, and then having those calibrated questions, how to get to the point, to drive collaboration, turn every head in the right direction, like that kind of facilitation. That's awesome. So you got to experience that firsthand. Do you recall any kind of specific scenarios, maybe about the questions that were asked or the nature of those interactions that might give some idea to the listeners on what we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, like, it was so funny. Like, they would go back into their toolkits and like pull something out, and eventually I would realize like you can just Google all of this stuff now. Like, management consultants love to talk about themselves. Like, all of this is on the internet today. One of them was like we were trying to make a big decision on what the new name of the company was going to be, and our VP of analytics had a great MBA, was a really strong leader, and he was like, and it could kind of had a bit of a southern drawl and was like could be really deceivingly smart, like you kind of underestimate him, and he'd be like, well, why wouldn't we do this? Think of all the reasons why we wouldn't pick the obvious choice, and then poke holes at it. And like only later do I realize like this is just something they teach you in your MBA, is like one of the kind of problem solving decision tree approaches is like, find out all the reasons you wouldn't do it. And if you still have a compelling reasons and none of those are very good, then go ahead with the obvious choice. But it was just like one of those things where I was like, oh, these are just toolboxes. This is just a toolkit that you happen to have that I need to go find and kind of adapt that works authentically for me. And and certainly the way he was able to kind of not say like I know how to do this because I have a fancy MBA. He kind of brought it to the table like, well, why don't we just try this? And I think like being able to find what works for you from those toolkits. I'm a big believer in this idea of like templates and examples. We don't have to start from scratch. And especially this idea of like with either generative AI or just kind of learning from things like podcasts. You don't have to start from scratch, and you don't have to go pay a couple $100,000 for the secret knowledge, right? A lot of this is out there today. So whether it's, like how do you summarize a technical story and tell it really easily? I mean, generative AI, you can put it in, and, even PowerPoint is going to start summarizing a lot of that for you in a really interesting way to start. We'll
Yeah.
see, if it holds up. But I'm so excited about this idea of like, you don't have to start from scratch. You can get some help, you can get started, and then you can learn and perfect and get better and better about it. So, that was something that I really learned from a lot of these, people who I thought were very savvy business operators, was like, how can I take something that they've done and just help me get started when it comes to solving one of these thorny business problems? And then we'll go from there. Then I can kind of trust some of my deep technical foundation and then try something out, learn from it, and try it again.
And that's a cool realization because those tools, the best of them, are so widely applicable, even in your personal life. In making a decision as a family, or influencing your child to make a good decision, right? And it's so funny that all these management skills just happen to be so gold for data analytics leaders specifically, because you just have the perfect problems for it. Highly technical, new, novel solutions that should be integrated into the business, driving and facilitating collaboration, encouraging and getting people to buy into experimentation, and then being able to read that data and the analytics and use that. So the key is really those skills, which are both leadership skills, communication skills. So that's why I think this season is so exciting for me too on the podcast, because everything that we do just kind of underpins that. So even the series that we're running with Dave, and then this is such a rich topic, and you can just dig into it from all kinds of angles. And I really enjoyed that today we got to do that also through that specific lens of career success, because a lot of talented, ambitious people in the community are looking to gain that edge, and they have a bunch of amazing ideas and visions that they want to bring to life. And we're all about carving out that pathway of how to do that. So this was a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Kate. So we talked about how I like to, these new ones, I would aim to keep it short, but obviously it didn't happen again. So there was just so much to hash out. Do you have any closing remarks for the audience, kind of tying everything together about what we covered today?
Yeah, I mean, I would think back to like what are some of the ways where I've seen some of these different themes in my career kind of all come together. And I think one of them is just around like when you are in a meeting and you are, someone is trying to figure out a hard to solve analytical problem. I'd encourage you to think about, using trusting your deep technical foundation, but think about also how you can summarize all of the things really quickly. One of the best ways you can do that, especially on the spot, is, the idea of, I like the phrase napkin math.
Mm-hmm.
Can we just do a little math on the back of an envelope, on the back of a napkin, and understand kind of whether we think this is a good bet for the business? To do great, napkin math like that, you have to know a few things about your business. You have to know some key facts about your conversion rates, your supply, your scale, your total addressable market. You've got to have a few of those in your back pocket when you come to the table. You've got to trust some of that deep technical foundation. But once you get there, then start to think about like, how are we really making money here? What is some of the unit economics? Like, can I figure out, are we going to be better at this than an old tech company or maybe a new upstart? And, is there enough money to give this a try? And then start to think through, if we think there's something there in the economics, how could we test it out? How can we try this at a small scale and de-risk it? How can I get some other people excited about this? Sometimes if you show up with a 30-page Excel model, it's almost like people have to make too much of an investment. But if you can show up with a napkin and say like, hey, I've got a bunch of credibility, I've got this idea, the numbers seem to work out, let's give this a try. Then start to think through, how can I tell that story really powerfully? And don't feel like you have to start from scratch. Use one of these templates. The best operators out there in the world are putting a lot of their information really pretty easily accessible. Plus, these Gen AI models are going to make it even easier to have a PowerPoint deck that competes with the big management consulting companies. So give it a try, and I hope it works out.
That's great. And if you think about it, nothing demonstrates your mastery of a particular subject more when you're able to explain it through napkin math, right? In that context, you're just so on top of it. You own the ideas, the history of it, the potentialities of it, that you are able to communicate it that way. So even just taking it away, like a key image for data analytics leaders too, who sometimes struggle with, but this is a complex thing. What we're doing is super complex. This is the technology underneath and the investments, and then the software and the hardware and everything in between. No, if you can really condense it and translate it into a language that will make those business stakeholders truly buy into it and embrace it, that's success, and that shows that you're really on top of it. So, Kate, this was a fantastic conversation. Thank you for your time. And well, our audience members will hear more from you as well, because now with the Data Storytellers Board of Advisors, we're preparing some exciting projects that the audience, I know already, will love.
All right. Thanks so much. It was a lot of fun.